What if the darkest secrets of Brazil's desert outlaws were never written down because they were too disturbing for any historian to risk describing? That single question opens a door that most people never dare to walk through, because the legend of the Cangaceiros is almost always presented as a mixture of rebellion, romance, and brutality. But behind the popular stories lies another layer, one built on whispered traditions that were never meant to survive on paper. These hidden practices shaped every choice these outlaws made, from the moment they entered the bush to the moment their bodies were left in the dust. And the closer you look, the more you realize how carefully these men and women crafted a world where official law had no meaning, and only their secret code determined who lived, who suffered, and who vanished without a trace. The deeper you go into the Sutao, the clearer it becomes that the Cangaceiro life operated almost like a parallel society. Not just a band of criminals, but a community bound by rituals no outsider could witness without risking their life. Recruits were tested, not through written rules, but through endurance, silence, and an almost ritualistic submission to the harshness of the desert. Some accounts describe nights where the fire flickered low and the group gathered for what seemed like simple rest, but those who got close enough reported strange gestures, murmured promises, and moments that felt less like planning and more like initiative. And yet, historians often skipped these descriptions, calling them exaggerations or superstition, because admitting their reality would force them to acknowledge a level of organization that transformed bandits into something closer to a clandestine order. What makes these traditions even more unsettling is how practical they were. Every belief had a purpose. Every ritual had a psychological effect. Fear kept outsiders away, loyalty kept deserters silent, and mystery made the Cangaceiro presence feel larger than life. In a land without radios, newspapers, or rapid communication, reputation was everything. And the outlaws understood that the more terrifying the story, the more control they had. So they cultivated an aura that blurred the line between man and myth, always leaving just enough truth hidden to make the legends impossible to fully dismiss. Even today, rural families recall moments when the arrival of a Cangaceiro band felt like a force of nature, something ancient and unpredictable, carrying rules that did not belong to the modern world. But the most intriguing part is how these dark traditions survived not by being documented, but by being avoided. The silence of historians becomes its own clue, pointing to stories too heavy, too symbolic, or too morally complex to reduce into academic language. And as we start opening these shadows, it becomes impossible not to wonder which parts were born from fear, which were deliberately hidden by the outlaws themselves, and which reveal truths we were never meant to read. You have been through this too, when you sense that something important is being left out, something that changes the entire picture. If this first glimpse has already shifted your perspective, leave a comment sharing what part struck you first. Make sure to like the video and check if you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. Because the trail these outlaws left behind only grows darker from here, leading us into the hidden code of loyalty and punishment that defined their world and shaped their most feared decisions. Once you step past the first veil of mystery surrounding these desert outlaws, you begin to see that their survival depended on something far stronger than violence or cunning. It depended on a code, not a written document, not a set of rules handed down from leader to recruit, but a living structure shaped by fear, necessity, and the unforgiving isolation of the Every member of a Cangaceiro band understood that loyalty was not optional. It was the only shield they had against betrayal, ambush, and the crushing pressure of a landscape that punished weakness more swiftly than any bullet. But loyalty in the Cangaco was different from the romanticized versions told in movies and schoolbooks. It was a loyalty measured through silence, obedience, and the willingness to accept punishments that no outsider could imagine without questioning what kind of world required such extremes. Inside the band, trust functioned like currency. A man who hesitated during an ambush, who spoke too much in a village, or who questioned the leader during a strategic decision risked being treated not just as unreliable, but as a danger to the entire group. And that danger had consequences. Some punishments were psychological, designed to break arrogance or re-establish hierarchy. Other punishments were physical, delivered with a precision that revealed how deeply group believed discipline was necessary for survival. Many oral accounts describe moments when a small mistake led to a terrifying silence within the group, a sign that the offender would soon face a ritual of correction. These rituals were not impulsive acts of cruelty. They were controlled, strategic, built to reaffirm authority and warn anyone else who might be tempted to test the boundaries. What made this internal justice truly unique was how it blended brutality with ceremony. But punishment was rarely just a beating or a verbal reprimand. It often involved symbolic actions, having to kneel in the dust while others watched without speaking, carrying a heavy object for days as a reminder of one's failure, or being forced to walk ahead of the group, exposed to danger until the leader decided trust had been regained. In extreme cases, especially when betrayal threatened the entire band, the punishment could escalate to mutilation or execution. And these acts were not hidden from the group. They were performed in plain view, reinforcing a message that loyalty was not based on affection, but on shared survival and the fear of collapsing the fragile network holding them together. There was also a psychological dimension that historians rarely explore. Living constantly under threat created a heightened sensitivity to signs of disloyalty. A casual comment, a nervous glance, or an unexplained absence could be interpreted as evidence of impending treachery. This paranoia was not irrational. Many bands were infiltrated by informants or faced ambushes because someone talked too much. So the code tightened. The punishments grew sharper, and the need to maintain absolute discipline became a kind of ritual in itself, shaping the group's identity as much as their weapons or clothing. Yet even with all this structure, contradiction lived at the heart of the Cangaco. These men and women were fugitives, rebels, outcasts fighting for survival, and yet they enforced order among themselves with a harshness rivaling the very authorities they resisted. This duality created an atmosphere where every decision carried emotional weight, where loyalty was both a bond and a threat, and where each punishment etched deeper marks into the psyche of the group. As you move deeper into their hidden world, the next shadows begin to reveal themselves, pointing toward the strange and secret rituals that took place before attacks, ambushes, and executions, rituals that blurred the line between faith, fear, and strategy, shaping how these outlaws prepared for moments when survival balanced on the edge of a blade. As the code of loyalty and punishment shaped the internal life of the band, another layer of their existence operated in a realm even more concealed. Before every ambush, every raid, every confrontation with soldiers or rival groups, the Cangaceros performed rituals that blended practicality, superstition, and a deep, almost instinctive need for psychological armor. These were not rituals for show. They were quiet, calculated acts meant to prepare the mind as much as the body, to turn fear into sharpened focus, and to transform uncertainty into a sense of invincibility. Outsiders often misunderstood these actions as signs of primitive belief or irrational mysticism, but within the band, they served as essential tools for maintaining unity and emotional control in an environment where hesitation could mean death. Some of these practices were simple. A man might tie a small cloth blessed by a local healer around his arm, believing it would turn bullets aside or cloud the vision of enemies. Others carried metal amulets engraved with scratched symbols no one outside the group could decipher. And then there were the whispered prayers, spoken under the breath just before the group moved out. These prayers did not always follow church teachings. They were hybrids, merging Catholic saints with folk spirits, ancestral guardians, and even elements of indigenous tradition absorbed through years of wandering. Each fighter had a slightly different version, but all shared a common goal: to create a mental shield, a sense of protection that allowed them to enter battle with steadier hands and clearer intentions. Yet, beneath these individual rituals lay collective ones that revealed much more about the psychology of the group. Oral stories speak of nights when the campfire burned unusually low, creating a circle of shadow rather. Dung Laich. In these moments, the leader might walk around the group, touching each member lightly on the shoulder. Some described it as a blessing. Others believed it was a way to assess who carried fear and who was ready. The silence during these moments was absolute. No one dared break the atmosphere, because the ritual was not about words but about presence, about transmitting a shared readiness that bound them together before the chaos of battle. One of the most unsettling elements of these pre-attack rituals was the use of symbolic gestures meant to reinforce the leader's authority. A weapon handed over and returned only after a moment of inspection. A subtle motion directing each fighter to a position in the upcoming ambush. A glance that conveyed expectation, trust, and warning all at once. These gestures, though silent, shifted the emotional energy of the group, turning scattered individuals into a unified force. Historians often overlook this psychological choreography, preferring to focus on the brutality of the attacks themselves, but without understanding this preparation, the actions of the Cangaceros appear chaotic, when in reality they were guided by a dark but deliberate structure. There are also mentions of more enigmatic behaviors. Some fighters reportedly avoided eating certain foods before an attack, believing they slowed reflexes or attracted bad luck. Others would scratch symbols into the dirt with the tip of a knife, erasing them quickly, as if hiding messages from an unseen enemy. And then there were moments when the wind or sound of animals was interpreted as a sign. A sudden shift in the air, the cry of a night bird, or the way the fire crackled could alter plans within seconds. These responses were not random. They reflected a worldview where nature, danger, and destiny blended into a single, ever-moving landscape that demanded constant interpretation. The more these rituals are examined, the easier it becomes to see that they were not signs of ignorance but strategies designed to shape emotion, enforce discipline, and sharpen instinct. They created a sense of inevitability, making each member feel that the moment ahead was already written, and all they had to do was step into it. And as these dark ceremonies deepened the group's unity, they also set the stage for what happened after an attack, when the violence itself became a message carved into bodies and landscapes, revealing the most feared side of the Cangaco and exposing the traditions that historians avoided describing with full clarity. Once the rituals of preparation were complete, and the ambush unfolded with ruthless precision, what followed often entered a realm far darker than the legends commonly suggest. For many bands, violence was not simply a tool of survival or revenge. It was a language. Every action left behind a message, and every message was crafted to echo across the Sertao long after horses galloped away and rifles stopped. Smoking. Villages, soldiers, informants, and rival groups all understood that the aftermath of a Cangachero attack carried as much meaning as the attack itself. This was a theater of fear, where cruelty became a calculated instrument for controlling territory, in shaping reputation in places where official authority was weak or non-existent. What made these acts so disturbing was not their brutality alone, but the deliberate symbolism behind them. Bodies were not always left where they fell. Sometimes they were arranged in specific positions, arms extended or crossed, as if frozen in a silent warning. In other cases, clothing was removed or altered to signal betrayal, cowardice, or allegiance broken. Oral accounts describe scenes where a single object, such as a hat, a cartridge belt, or a torn piece of fabric, was placed on a corpse to indicate the reason for the punishment. These symbolic gestures communicated complex messages without a single written word, allowing the outlaws to establish psychological dominance over vast regions without needing to be physically present. Torture, too, was often used as a performance rather than an uncontrolled eruption of anger. Survivors, rare as they were, describe moments when a captured informant or rival was subjected to slow, methodical punishment, not only to extract information but to create a memory so terrifying that it spread from village to village like wildfire. Cuts made in deliberate patterns, burns placed in specific areas of the body, or mutilations carried out in ways that mirrored earlier punishments within the group, all indicate a chilling continuity. These were traditions, passed down through experience, reinforced by fear, and understood intuitively by everyone who lived under the shadow of the Kanga. What historians often avoid discussing is the psychological structure that made such cruelty possible. In the endless heat and isolation of the Sertao, violence became intertwined with identity. The more feared a band was, the more control they had. And the more control they had, the less they needed to rely on constant movement and raids. Fear did the traveling for them. People changed their routes, abandoned disputes, or complied with demands simply because they had heard how a body had been left in a neighboring village. It was a strategy as powerful as any weapon, and the outlaws understood this deeply. One of the most revealing aspects of this dark tradition is the effect it had inside the band itself. Members learned to read the signs left behind after each attack, understanding not just the purpose but the emotion embedded in each act. A body left untouched might signal a victory without personal significance. A body marked with specific cuts could mean betrayal. A corpse displayed in a public space might signal defiance against soldiers or coronels. These messages were not accidental. They were woven into the fabric of the group's identity, reinforcing hierarchy, loyalty, and the constant pressure to remain useful, obedient, and vigilant. The fear they spread shaped the land itself. Villages that once resisted became silent. Roads that once bustled emptied at certain hours. Even the wind carried stories, exaggerated by distance, but grounded in truth. Each tale added weight to the mysteries surrounding the Cangaco, making the outlaws seem more myth than human, more force of nature than organized group. And as we move deeper into these forgotten details, the next shadow reveals how the role of women in the Cangaco carried its own hidden rules, rituals, and punishments, many of which were far more complex than the simplified versions surviving in mainstream narratives. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments. What detail here struck you the most, or challenged what you believed about the Cangaco? Your perspective helps uncover how these stories resonate today. As the shadow of violence stretched across the layer of the Cangaco world operated with rules just as severe, but far less understood, the role of women inside the band. Popular retellings often portray figures like Maria Bonita as symbols of romance, rebellion, or partnership, but the truth is far more complex and far darker. Women who joined the Cangaco stepped into a system shaped by danger, jealousy, loyalty, secrecy, and emotional pressure that few historians dared to document in full. They lived inside a structure where affection coexisted with brutality, where protection could shift into punishment, and where the lines between love, fear, and survival were constantly blurred by the harsh reality of life on the run. Women were not passive companions. They held influence, mediated disputes, carried messages, and sometimes shaped strategic decisions through their proximity to leaders. Yet their position came with unspoken conditions. A woman's loyalty was monitored as closely as a soldier's, and any hint of betrayal, real or imagined, could ignite extreme reactions. Oral accounts tell of moments when a man's suspicion triggered humiliating punishments or violent outbursts, the consequences rippling through the entire group. Emotional tension was heightened by the constant pressure of escaping soldiers, navigating alliances, and surviving hunger and heat. In that volatile environment, relationships became charged with intensity, making acts of love and acts of vengeance feel inseparable. Jealousy, especially, played a powerful role in shaping internal dynamics. A look held too long, a conversation whispered at dusk, or a small gesture interpreted the wrong way could ignite conflicts that no ritual or code could fully contain. Some bands developed quiet traditions to manage this tension. A woman suspected of straying might be questioned by older members or temporarily isolated from group discussions. In other cases, the accused man was forced to assert loyalty through labor or symbolic acts, meant to restore trust. These measures were seldom recorded by chroniclers, who preferred to avoid the intimate complexities of life within the Cangaco. But underneath the myths, these emotional negotiations reveal a world governed as much by psychological strain as by open violence. There were also deeply private rituals tied to protection and fertility. Some women carried herbs gifted by local healers, believed to guard against illness or unwanted pregnancy. Others maintained small pouches containing hair, fabric, or soil from their home villages, tokens meant to anchor them emotionally in a life ruled by instability. Pregnancy, when it occurred, introduced another layer of secrecy. Some women were hidden during the late stages, while others disappeared entirely from historical records, raising questions about decisions made inside the band that no one wanted to describe publicly. These absences hint at choices shaped, not by cruelty alone, but by the impossible conditions of survival in a hostile landscape. Revenge, too, had its own rituals. A woman harmed by a rival, a soldier, or a villager could influence the band's next move, sometimes directing the emotional logic behind an attack. Her pain became part of the group's identity, and her anger could echo across entire regions through violent retaliation. These responses were not simply emotional reactions. They reinforced internal unity by transforming personal suffering into collective purpose. This dynamic helped solidify the presence of women as integral, though often hidden, architects of the Cangaco mythos. What stands out beneath these stories is the sheer emotional intensity that shaped every decision. Love was a shield, a weapon, a vulnerability, and a spark for conflict. Women navigated this world with remarkable resilience, balancing autonomy and danger in ways that defy simplistic interpretations. And as we move deeper into the core of these hidden traditions, the next shadows draw us toward the uneasy intersection of faith, violence, and fear that governed the outlaws' relationship with religion, creating rituals and promises that shaped their actions in ways even darker and more symbolic. As the emotional tensions surrounding relationships shaped the inner life of the band, another influence, just as powerful, and often far more contradictory, governed their choices: religion. The Cangaco lived inside a paradox where violence and devotion intertwined so naturally that even seasoned historians hesitate to describe the full extent of this fusion. To the outlaws, faith was not a distant doctrine preached from pulpits. It was a living force that haunted trails, guided decisions, and gave meaning to the chaos around them. Yet this faith did not soften their brutality. Instead, it became a tool of survival, a moral compass twisted by the circumstances of a world without mercy. Most gangacheros carried rosaries, crosses, or medals of saints, worn alongside knives and ammunition. These religious objects were not simply symbols of belief, but emotional anchors. In moments before ambushes or reprisals, a fighter might touch the small medal on his chest, whispering a vow or begging forgiveness for what was about to unfold. These gestures were not contradictions. They reflected a worldview where sin and survival were inseparable, where divine protection was desperately sought even as acts of extreme violence were prepared. The relentless danger of the Sertao blurred the boundaries between right and wrong, allowing faith to adapt into something pragmatic, intimate, and deeply personal. Promises made during moments of fear often shaped the band's future actions. Some fighters vowed to perform acts of charity if they survived a gunfight. Others swore to protect a certain village or spare a specific family. But these vows were not always kept, and in the Sertao, breaking a promise carried spiritual consequences. Many believed that misfortune, unexplained accidents, or even sudden deaths within the band were manifestations of divine punishment. This belief built an atmosphere of tension, where every loss felt like a sign, every setback a warning, and every streak of good fortune a blessing sealed through blood. Reports also describe darker rituals, the kind whispered by elders long after the Cangaco ended. These stories speak of charms prepared by healers, mixtures of herbs and animal parts meant to close a fighter's body against bullets. Some leaders visited spiritual practitioners who performed ceremonies at night, drawing symbols in the dirt or chanting verses mixed with fragments of Catholic prayers. These rituals were not done publicly. They existed in the shadows, shaping the emotional resilience of the group far more than outsiders ever understood. Fear of the supernatural played a powerful role as well. Many fighters interpreted unexpected noises, sudden winds, or the flight of certain birds as omens. A cry heard too early in the morning might delay a raid. A strange shape seen near a campfire could trigger a change in direction. These beliefs did not weaken the band's efficiency. On the contrary, they created a heightened awareness, a readiness that kept the group alert to every detail in an environment where misreading a sign could lead to death. Women held their own role in these spiritual dynamics. Some were believed to have stronger intuition, sensing danger before others. Their dreams were taken seriously, especially when recurring symbols appeared. A dream featuring water, fire, or a distant church bell could shift the emotional energy of the entire group, shaping decisions more powerfully than strategic analysis. These moments reveal how deeply psychological and symbolic life was inside the Cangaco, where faith, fear, and instinct blended into a single guiding force. Through these layers of belief, the Outlaws built a worldview that justified contradictions and transformed the Sertao into a stage where every event carried meaning. And as this spiritual tension deepened, another force emerged at the heart of the band's reputation: the idea that their violence, however brutal, sometimes represented a form of justice in a land abandoned by authority. This unsettling belief brings us directly to the next shadow, where vengeance and righteousness fused into a narrative that reshaped how entire communities interpreted the presence of the Conga. As faith wove itself through the lives of the Congacheros, a different kind of belief began shaping how entire communities interpreted their presence. In places where the law felt distant and justice seemed reserved for the wealthy or the wealthy, the arrival of an outlaw band often carried a strange dual meaning. To some, they were predators. To others, they were avengers. And this perception created one of the darkest and most misunderstood layers of the Cangaco: the idea that violence, when delivered by those living outside the law, could function as a form of divine correction in a landscape marked by abuse, hunger, and neglect. Many oral histories describe situations where villagers quietly approved of a Cangachero attack, not because they supported criminality, but because the target was a coronel known for cruelty. In these cases, vengeance became a moral currency. A beating, a theft, or even a killing could be reinterpreted as justice imposed on someone who had long escaped accountability. This belief, whispered behind closed doors, built a complex emotional relationship between the population and the outlaws. Fear never disappeared, but it mixed with a subtle hope that the same group capable of terror could also provide relief from oppressive power. Congacero leaders understood this dynamic well. On some occasions, they punished thieves who preyed on the poor or confronted abusive landowners in ways that soldiers never dared. These actions, while brutal, created a paradoxical sense of order. People began to see the band not merely as criminals but as unpredictable agents of fairness, a distorted reflection of the justice system that failed them. This perception helped the outlaws build networks of informants who warned them about troop movements, betrayal attempts, or safe paths through unfamiliar regions. Villagers who felt protected, even indirectly, were more willing to offer silence, food, or shelter when needed. This phenomenon was not unique to the Brazilian backlands. Throughout history, groups operating outside formal power have often become symbols of resistance in desperate times. But in the Sertao, where survival depended on relationships built through fear and favor, the moral lines blurred more deeply. A man who lost a family member to Congachero violence might still recall with conflicted respect the moment when the same band punished a landowner who had exploited entire communities. This emotional contradiction reveals why the Conga became so deeply rooted in the imagination of the Northeast. It exposed a truth no one wanted to confront, that in a land forgotten by the state, justice often came from the wrong hands. The internal dynamics of the band reflected this twisted morality as well. When a leader delivered what was perceived as righteous punishment, the emotional energy inside the group shifted. Members felt justified, even emboldened, believing their violent acts aligned with a larger purpose. This sense of mission, however dark, helped them endure hardship, hunger, and constant pursuit. It reinforced unity and legitimized decisions that, without this moral framework, might have shattered the group from within. Violence became not just survival, but narrative, identity, and mission. Yet, the weight of this role took its toll. The expectation to act as instruments of justice added emotional pressure, especially when moral boundaries blurred beyond recognition. A single mistake, a misjudged punishment, or an attack fueled by personal anger rather than communal grievance could fracture the delicate relationship between the band and the people whose silence protected them. These moments left scars not only on the land but on the group itself, creating doubts, conflicts, and simmering tensions that shaped the darker chapters to come. as we move deeper into these layered contradictions. The shadows reveal another unsettling aspect of the Cangaco, the secrets that never reached written records, stories of betrayals, disappearances, and hidden negotiations that unfolded in silence. Before we continue, share your own impressions in the comments. Which part of this moral tension resonates most with you or challenges your understanding of justice in forgotten places? As the moral contradictions surrounding justice deepened the aura of the another shadow settled quietly behind their legend, the secrets that never reached official records. These were the stories told in low voices long after dusk, the ones shared only among those who had lived inside the band or witnessed moments outsiders were never meant to understand. Betrayals whispered but never confirmed, sudden disappearances that seemed to evaporate into the desert air, and alliances so unlikely that even chroniclers who specialize in the Cangaco avoided mentioning them publicly. These unspoken histories reveal a side of the Outlaws shaped not just by violence or ritual, but by a constant struggle to manage the invisible forces threatening to fracture the group from within. One of the most recurring elements in these hidden accounts is the phenomenon of sudden desertion. A member would wake one morning, gather his belongings quietly, and vanish before the sun rose. Sometimes this meant the deserter feared punishment for a mistake he had not yet been accused of. Other times, it meant he had been bribed by soldiers or coronels in exchange for information. But in many cases, the disappearance came without explanation, leaving the band to question whether the missing fighter had been captured, killed, or was secretly working against them. This uncertainty eroded trust like rust along steel, creating paranoia that influenced every decision in the days that followed. A darker possibility lingered behind some disappearances: internal execution. Historians rarely discuss this openly, but oral tradition points to moments when a member suspected of betrayal was quietly removed by the group, his death disguised as an escape or ambush. These actions were not taken lightly. They followed long nights of whispered debate, tense glances, and the heavy silence that settled before judgment fell. But the lack of documentation surrounding these events did not erase their impact. They shaped the emotional weight that each member carried, reinforcing the belief that loyalty was not only demanded but enforced through consequences that no one dared describe openly. Beyond betrayals. Within the group, the Cangaco also maintained unexpected relationships with local authorities. These alliances were not built on trust but on necessity. Soldiers, coronels, and even politicians occasionally struck covert agreements with band leaders, trading information or temporary protection in exchange for silence or strategic advantage. These arrangements were fragile, often broken the moment they ceased to benefit one side. Yet their existence reveals how deeply the Cangaco influenced regional politics, weaving itself into the very structures that claimed to oppose it. Another layer of secrecy emerged in the form of hidden negotiations. A village threatened by repeated raids might send a representative to plead for safety, offering food, money, or information in return. These deals were rarely spoken of publicly, as acknowledging them meant admitting vulnerability. But for the Outlaws, such agreements served as invisible shields, allowing them to move freely without constant fear of betrayal. Over time, these unrecorded exchanges created a silent network of cooperation and intimidation, one that shaped travel routes, attack strategies, and alliances across the Sertao. Even more unsettling are the accounts of messages delivered through objects rather than words. A scratched symbol left on a tree, a piece of fabric tied to a fence post, or a cartridge placed upright beside a traylall served as communication tools in a land where speaking openly was dangerous. These coded signals guided band members, warned allies, and threatened enemies. They reveal a system of intelligence far more organized than the chaotic image often associated with the What all these secrets share is their disappearance from formal history. Not because they lacked importance, but because writing them down required acknowledging that the line between outlaw and authority, between victim and opportunist, was far more fluid than most people are willing to accept. And as the layers of this hidden world unfold, the next shadow reveals the powerful influence that myth-making, selective storytelling, and political interests had in shaping what survived about the Cangaco and what was buried in silence. As the hidden betrayals, silent negotiations, and unspoken rituals of the Cangaco slipped through the cracks of official memory. Another force stepped forward to reshape their image. The storytellers, chroniclers, politicians, filmmakers, and regional leaders all played a part in crafting the version of the Cangaco that reached the public. What survived in books and newspapers was not a neutral record of events, but a carefully curated blend of myth and omission, shaped by agendas, fears, and the need to control how history remembered one of Brazil's most turbulent eras. Over time, the raw complexity of the Cangaceiro world was smoothed into something easier to digest, leaving behind a distorted reflection that hid as much as it revealed. The first layer of manipulation came from the authorities. To justify military campaigns and political strategies, officials often portray Cangaceiros as savage monsters or mindless criminals driven purely by greed and bloodlust. Reports exaggerated brutality, downplayed acts of calculated strategy, and ignored the social conditions that allowed the movement to grow. This version of events painted a simple narrative: law versus chaos. It allowed governments to claim moral authority even when their own actions were marked by corruption, abuse, and extrajudicial violence. In this story, the outlaws became symbols, not people. Their rituals, fears, loyalties, and contradictions were erased to make room for a cleaner, more convenient tale. But the opposite distortion also emerged. As decades passed, some storytellers began to romanticize the transforming brutal raids into daring adventures and turning figures like Lampia and Maria Bonita into icons of rebellion. Songs, films, and literature softened their cruelty, highlighting charisma and courage while muting the terror they inspired. This romanticized version appealed to those who saw in the outlaws a form of resistance against oppressive structures. Yet it also buried the darkest aspects of their traditions, leaving audiences with a selective image that glossed over the rituals of punishment, the psychological control, and the internal conflicts that defined daily life inside the band. Even historians, constrained by moral expectations and limited access to primary testimonies, found themselves choosing which details to emphasize and which to quietly omit. Some avoided discussing the roles of women beyond romantic partnerships. Others minimized the spiritual rituals that shaped decisions. Topics like torture, internal execution, and symbolic displays of violence often received only vague mentions, as if describing them fully risked crossing an invisible line of academic propriety. And so, entire chapters of Cangaco culture faded into the margins, leaving behind unanswered questions that still shape the movement's legacy. Regional politics further complicated the narrative. Certain communities preferred to highlight stories where the outlaws punished abusive landowners, while others emphasized the fear they brought. These competing interpretations created layers of myth that shifted depending on who was telling the story. In some families, a Cangaceiro visit was remembered as an act of justice. In others, it was recalled as a day of horror. This fragmentation of memory ensured that no single version of the Cangaco could ever be fully trusted, because each retelling carried the emotional weight of personal experience, pride, shame, or political strategy. What results from all these distortions is a legacy built on both truth and silence. The Cangaco became a mirror reflecting the fears and aspirations of entire communities, a story shaped not only by the outlaws themselves, but by those who needed to interpret them for their own purposes. And as these layered interpretations accumulated, the original reality slipped further away, leaving more shadows than clarity. These shadows now guide us toward the final, most introspective question: what does this dark legacy reveal about Brazil today? And why do its echoes still resonate so powerfully across the Sertão and beyond? As the myth-making around the Cangaco reshaped its legacy, a final question lingers like dust suspended in the heat of the Sertão. What does this dark inheritance reveal about the Brazil that exists today? The rituals, the brutality, the symbols carved into bodies and landscapes, the secret agreements, the silence of historians, the distortions crafted by politics and art, all of it formed more than just a chapter of regional folklore. It became a blueprint for understanding how power functions in places where institutions fail, how violence becomes language when justice feels unreachable, and how communities cling to stories that help them make sense of fear, abandonment, and survival. The shadows left behind by the Cangaceros are not relics. They continue to echo in attitudes toward rebellion, authority, and the persistent idea that fairness sometimes comes from the wrong hands in many parts of the country, especially those shaped by drought, inequality, and political neglect. The emotional memory of the Cangaco still pulses underneath the surface. People who never witnessed a single act of outlaw violence speak about the movement with a familiarity that seems almost ancestral. They interpret modern conflicts, abuse of power, and even local disputes through lenses forged a century ago, comparing public figures to outlaws or criminals, casting everyday struggles in the same dramatic tension that once defined life in the back. This persistence reveals how deeply symbolic the Cangaco became, not merely as a historical event, but as a cultural vibration that refuses to fade, guiding instincts and shaping identity long after the last rifle fell silent. The hidden traditions of the Outlaws also highlight how communities adapt when official systems collapse. The Sertao of the past was not simply violent, it was abandoned, and in abandonment, people created their own logic, their own justice, their own stories to explain why suffering followed them and how resistance could take shape. The Cangaceros stepped into that void, embodying a distorted solution born from desperation and shaped by the unforgiving land. Understanding this helps illuminate why, even today, regions underserved by institutions often turn to informal leaders, local or symbolic figures who mirror some of the emotional roles once performed by the bandits of the desert. There is also a lingering fascination with the contradiction at the heart of the Cangaco, the coexistence of devotion and brutality, loyalty and treachery, community and terror. This duality resonates deeply in a country still negotiating its relationship with authority, faith, and violence. The contradictions feel familiar because they reflect realities that continue to shape modern life. In this way, the Cangaco becomes a metaphor for the nation's struggle to reconcile its wounds with its aspirations, its myths with its truths, and its longing for justice with the forces that continually distort it. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of this legacy is the silence, the details omitted by historians, the stories soft in films, the testimonies hidden by families, the records altered by politics. These absences speak as loudly as the surviving legends. What is not told reveals the deep discomfort of confronting a past where victims and villains often traded places, where violence became both punishment and salvation, and where entire communities learned to navigate life between awe and terror. This silence continues to shape how the present interprets the past, ensuring that the movement remains suspended between fact and myth, truth and mystery. And as these echoes continue to vibrate across time, the question becomes not simply what the Cangaco was, but what it still is: a symbol of forgotten injustices, a reflection of unresolved wounds, and a reminder that darkness often survives in the stories we choose not to tell. If you've reached this point and felt the weight of these hidden traditions, let me know by commenting the phrase, "I am here until the end." Because knowing who walks through these shadows with us gives depth to the conversation. If this journey revealed something new to you, consider subscribing so you can explore more stories that peel back the layers of history, and leave a like to show that this kind of deep, uncomfortable exploration matters. There is another video waiting beside this one that connects with everything we explored here. So follow the trail and continue this journey with me there.